World History Discussions Special. We're about to enter my favorite segment, which is part 2 out of 7 on the classical societies from 500 BCE to 500 CE in the Traditions and Encounters textbook. It's going to be chapters 7 to 12, and I love classical Persia. That's going to be the very next chapter we hit in chapter 7, the first classical society, and we're going to jump into that in the very next discussion. You can see how big that empire is, and it's about 2/3 the size of the current contiguous United States. But big changes between the ancient world in part 1, which was 3500 BCE to 500 BCE. That was a 3,000 year period versus this 1,000 year period of the classical world, 500 BC to 500 CE, is that now you've got huge empires, not just I guess you might call stuff like Egypt pre-empires, or the societies of Mesopotamia all the way from the Sumerians up to the Babylonians, the Hittites, all that. They were all kind of, I'm going to call them pre-empires. They were empires, but they were on a much smaller scale than what you see here. Now you get these massive empires. And I do warn you, we're going to be Eurasia-centric. We won't get back to the Americas or the Pacific Islands, or really even Africa other than North Africa, until chapters 18 and 20. 18 on Sub-Saharan Africa, 20 on Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, and that's in part 4. So next two sections are going to all cover Eurasia. So basically, to sum up what's in part 2, I'm going to show you a different map that's way oversimplified. It's not even in this Traditions and Encounters book, and I love the maps in the Traditions and Encounters textbook, to say the least. There's a map of the Silk Roads. That's not till chapter 12, but chapter 12 is kind of the climax of this, bringing everything in this part 2 together and showing how interconnected Eurasia really was with these huge empires. And Silk Roads really does peak 2,000 years ago from roughly 98 BCE to roughly 180 CE. We're going to get into that much later. This is also the Axial Age, where all these big religions come up. Like, we studied Hinduism in chapter 4, but now Buddhism is going to rise in chapter 9, which is all about ancient India. And Confucianism is going to come up in China in chapter 8. Taoism, Confucianism, and legalism. And then in chapter 10 on Greece, we're going to have Greek philosophy. In chapter 11 on the Romans, we're going to have Christianity. Islam won't rise until part 3, which is after 500 CE. That's in the 600s. Chapter 14 will be on the rise of Islam, but nonetheless is considered the Axial Age. In fact, ancient Persia, the very next society we're going to study, has one of my favorite ancient religions, Zoroastrianism. That'll be the very next discussion. We're going to talk about how it kind of influenced Christianity theologically. That's where you get your duality of good and evil and heaven and hell and all that. Here's an oversimplified Silk Roads map, and I know I'm kind of ruining it. This isn't really true. It's oversimplified, but it's almost like you can think of it as the United States of Eurasia. It reminds me of the USA, but 3 times larger in sea to shining sea, Pacific to Atlantic. Han, China, Kushan, India, Parthia and Persia, and then, of course, the Roman Empire. But yeah, Rome and Han, China were at their height at the same time. Then you had the Parthians, which were semi-nomadic in Persia, and the Kushans in northern India, also semi-nomadic, and the Silk Roads linking them all together, really from here to here, and then the maritime Silk Roads. We're going to get at all that in chapter 12. So chapter 7 is all about Persia. Then chapter 8, we go to China. Chapter 9, India. Chapter 10, heavily on the Greeks, Mediterranean phase 1. Chapter 11, the Romans, Mediterranean phase 2. Chapter 12, all on the Silk Roads, and then religion, and then disease, and then the fall of the Roman Empire is where that ends. I'm really pumped about the next millennium. Here it is over here. And we're in classical antiquity from, they say, roughly 600 BC to roughly 500 CE. And we're in Eurasia, so yep, you can see them, Han, China, and all the kingdoms of India, the Persian empires, with the Achaemenids being the first and my favorite of them, and the Roman Empire and all that, all linked on the Silk Roads. And we're going to start this section with chapter 7 on the empires of Persia, this 1,000-year period, starting with my favorite of the Persian empires, the Achaemenid, which is the first huge world empire. Pumped for this next section.